Okay, so hopefully the best thing a moderator can do is set things up and get out of the way. So I'm going to try and do that to a certain extent, but I may fail. Our panel this afternoon is going to now come back out a little bit. And after the series of case studies we had this morning in specific areas, we're going to now look and see what are the parallels, what are the through lines that we can pull in from some of that, and talk a little bit about issues like generalizability, methodological challenges, potential needs to figure out what future research we might need in order to answer some of the questions and the gaps that we found. So we're going to start off with Bagel Hill, and he's going to give us some sense of some methodological issues, and then we'll go with Betsy Rosenblatt, who does some fascinating research on the motivations and on my favorite topic, shame. And then Michael's going to be our final knitter together, we hope, of some of the things that we've talked about. And then hopefully I can generate a little bit of flow back and forth between the three of them for conversation, and we'll come back out to the room. So,
all right.
Michael.
Thank you. Cool. All right, well, thanks. Okay, so, all right, so like a lot of the work that's been presented here, my research tends to be very, I'm a sociologist by training, not a lawyer, although I've hung out with them plenty as a fellow at the Berkman Center for quite a while. And like a lot of the work that has been presented here, I have addressed these issues by starting out looking at work products for the most part and then working sort of backwards towards the types of processes that created them. A lot of the things that we've seen presented here today were based on interviews of particular creators in a particular field. I've done work on innovation more broadly, a lot of work on free and open source software, a lot of work on wikis, so peer production more broadly, and a lot of work today, which I'll be talking about in the context of remixing communities. What we find when we do these kinds of work, when we look at creative, like many types of creative objects and look to see where they came from, we find that very often the law has very little to do with why people are creating. Now, what I'm going to focus on today in terms of the broader sort of takeaways are mostly methodological, which is that what I have done is, although I think the interview studies are very important, what I've tried to do is look in big communities of people, do mostly large-scale quantitative analyses of how people are actually behaving to identify, for example, the ways in which people are upset when someone else reuses their work, and why, and then to test theories about those, and in particular to run and to look at natural experiments in the context of online communities where actually the rules have been changed in ways that we can use to understand some of these effects. All right. The work that I'm going to be presenting today is based on the context of remixing, which, as will be familiar to many people here, just refers to the recombination of existing sort of creative works, often music or video or interactive media, very widespread and especially very common among youth. So, and I'm going to be talking about a context in which young people are using this as well. I'm going to show you a couple studies that I've done in the context of the Scratch online community. Are people here familiar with Scratch at all? Does anyone have a kid that uses it? Well, you may want to go home if you have kids. After this talk, you may choose to go home and show them. But Scratch is it's a computer programming environment that I'll show you about. And it's also an online community where people to share programs that they've made. Most of these are animations or interactive games, and I'll show you some examples. That's a picture of what the online community looks, where kids are sharing their projects. And it is importantly designed and built entirely around remixing. So the term Scratch it's supposed to refer to like, DJs mixing, although I understand that scratching is not remixing. That is what it was supposed to evoke. And Scratch is really, really big. It was launched in 2007 at the MIT Media Lab where I was a graduate student. It has, as of today when I was preparing this talk, more than 7 million projects have been shared by more than 4 million users. Most of these users are young. The median age when a person signs up is 12 or 13. Somewhere in that area. And it's also a social media environment. More than 35 million comments have been posted. There's been lots and lots of interaction in this space. So it's very big. This is what Scratch looks like, or this is what Scratch looked like. It still looks a lot like this. This is an older version from the version of Scratch where these analyses were done in. But the basic idea is it's a as I mentioned, a programming environment, but very based on animations. So you can see there's a little what's called a sprite, the picture of the cat, which you can then control, and you control it by writing programs. And you can take those blocks over on the your left, and you can move them together and snap them together so that they describe programs that you would like, for example, this cat to do. So right now it says repeat 10 times, move 10 steps forward, change to the next costume. So this is going to make an animation of a cat that looks like it's walking as it moves across the screen. What's fantastic about this, if you've tried programming before, is that you can't make a syntactically incorrect program. The box will fit together. It may not do what you want. In fact, it probably won't the first time, but it will never fail to work at all. And so it's very forgiving and an option. People can do really incredible stuff with this as well. This is an example of a project shared in Scratch relatively early, and an example of what the Scratch online community looks like. This is a spaceship game called Neo, and you take this little crayon-drawn spaceship, and you move it up and down, and you shoot little pellets at opposing spaceships in a way that's familiar if you've played similar types of games. You can see that it's also a social media environment, so down in the bottom corner you have information this project had at the time that I made the screenshot, been viewed 7,000 times. It has been tagged, people can love it, which is a lot like liking, except more enthusiastic. Every project is available for download by any user of Scratch, so anyone can click the download button. It will then download it so that they can open it up in their version of Scratch and they can make changes. And if they want to, they can then go back here, and up in the top corner there's a share button where they can then share their remixed version of the project on the website. And this was important from the context of building a site for learning, because the idea is that kids, maybe they couldn't make a very complicated program, but they could remix someone else's complicated program, and in that process they might learn more, they might learn some of those complicated techniques. So here's the Neo project again. Here is a remix of the Neo project. You can tell I'm an election cycle behind. This is an older one. This is a version of Neo called Star Wars Republican Gunship, where it's like a mashup of Star Wars figures and Republican political figures who then shoot at Empire spaceships with Democratic political figures. And I like the comment here, which is I'm sorry if this offends you. My version, you'll understand if you're the average American. And also, I'm a Democrat, so I love this game. It's like this kid, the early political consciousness coming through. But this person is, and this is exactly the kind of thing that the site was designed to promote. This person is able to take the game, customize it, change the programming a little bit, change some of the images and graphics, and create a new thing. And there are tons and tons of remixes in Scratch. I forget the exact proportion, but of those 8 million projects, something around a quarter of them are actually remixed versions of existing projects. You can see down here that we've tracked the fact that it is, that it was a remix, and I'll come back and talk about how that happens as well. Now, this is an incredibly high fidelity version of Duck Hunt, the old Nintendo game, which has been uploaded to Scratch. And this is not a remix. So this gives you a little bit of a sense. Even though this is clearly a remix in the broader cultural sense, it is not a remix in the sense of Scratch. And this also gets at some of the senses of ownership and norms, which I'll get to in the community more broadly. People have no problem taking, for example, Star Wars characters and integrating them into their games. They have no problems making near perfect reimplementations of Duck Hunt. This game, although itself not a remix, has been remixed many, many times by lots of people who include lots of, make it their own in various ways, some of which are actually very cool and fun. This is a remix. This is called Add Yourself Getting Sued by Viacom. I decided to add it for this crowd. But this is a project in which other users are remixing this by adding their own characters, which are in some ways attacking a representative of Viacom, who they are upset with, presumably because Viacom was taking down YouTube videos that they were sharing on YouTube. So kids were upset about it in this ways. I think this is an interesting sort of point. This is, remixes are tracked within the system. And today, this information is displayed to any user. So you can see in this highlighted area down here, we can see that this Star Wars Republican gunship was based on Kuri's project, and that it was shared by someone else. So we have automatic attribution in the system. And every piece of media shared in Scratch is released under a free culture license. It's released under the Creative Commons Attribution Share Alike license, which is the same license that Wikipedia uses. It allows anyone to modify it and redistribute it as long as they maintain credit, or as long as they give attribution. And that actually is done automatically within the system. So it's sort of, it just works. This is explained very clearly in kid-friendly terms on the license. This is if you click on that button right there, you'll be taken to this page, which describes a lot of things. The part that I'll highlight is this idea, what if I don't want others to remix my projects? And the answer is, of course, everything on Scratch is remixable by sharing your work on the Scratch website. You agree to license it under this license. It means it's okay for anyone to reuse the ideas, music, artwork, or anything else found in your Scratch project. If you don't want others to view and remix your creations, don't share them on the Scratch website. And there are community members that go around and remind people of this all the time. Now, despite the fact that Scratch is created as a platform for remixing and engagement, that doesn't mean everyone is thrilled about it, or necessarily thrilled about when their work gets reused. So one that's cool thing about doing research in Scratch, and this is getting onto the methodological piece, is that we can see every single reaction. In fact, we can see when someone else has seen another person's project. We can see every view. So we can look at every reaction and every non-reaction by user within the system. And so one thing that I've done in some early work is actually look at every project, every remix, which has been seen by the creator of that remix. And what we see is lots and lots of responses. Now those responses are varied. Some people say things like, I love what you do with my code, great idea. Some people say things that are less positive, like, I pretty much made this entire game. Some people say, hello, Mr. Plagiarist, or copycat, and then some people say, all right, you crap-eating, thumb-sucking baby, become really aggressive. Now, we don't know if that's because they're upset about some conception of plagiarism or exactly what the norm is, and then, of course, we get other things like just things that are hard to exactly code. B for peanut butter, B for the butter. All right. So, but we have millions of these kinds of responses within the system. So this is so this research project came and looking at all these sorts of responses. What we find is that people respond very often. That actually original creators who've seen a work are likely to leave a comment. About 40% of the time, they're willing to respond. And that these responses vary. Most of the time, about half of the time, when people choose to leave a comment, which is to say about 20% of the time, that anyone remixes a project, the users will, and this is based on a coded sample, they will leave comments that say things like hey, Mr. Plagiarist, or something along those lines. And those are often those accusations of plagiarism are usually negative. They're not positive accusations, although those do exist in some cases as well. One thing we tried to do then was actually to look at some of the reasons why, predict when people are likely to accuse another person of plagiarism, right? We can actually see what is it about the projects that are causing these kinds of responses. We found, for example, we tested a series of hypotheses that came from a kind of literature which you are all engaging in. And we found things like when people have invested more time and energy into a project, when they've built larger or more complicated projects, they are indeed significantly more likely to accuse other people of plagiarism. We tested a theory that people will be less likely to accuse the remixers of their projects of plagiarism if the project being remixed is a remix, and we found no evidence for this. People were just as likely to accuse other people of plagiarism, even if the project being remixed was itself a remix. We also found that people were as likely to accuse plagiarism, less likely to accuse remixers of their project of plagiarism if they had shared their at least one remix themselves. We tested that theory. And again, we found no effect. The fact that someone was engaging in remixing within this community made them no less likely to accuse people, at least in terms of the degree to which we could estimate this using these methods. I'm sparing you the math. I hope you appreciate that. But the paper's online, and you're welcome to check it out. And so this is kind of surprising, but what it really sort of hit home to us is that there is in this way that we can back out and understand and actually begin to build models of a set of norms between good copying and bad copying, even in a context in which everything is sort of being copied. Now, I'll talk one more thing. Another thing that came up was that people raised was around one issue. So when we saw this, the team that was building this saw all these accusations of plagiarism. We wanted to do something about it. And so when the site was originally launched, we had information on what was being remixed, but it wasn't being displayed to the users of the system. So we decided to try to address negative sort of attitudes about remixing by automatically crediting people, right? This idea that, or I should say, automatically attributing people. I'm about to say that there's a difference between credit and attribution. And so we built this system, which is displayed right here, where it said this project is based on someone else, and it happened automatically. Here's just another example of it blown up. So it would tell you when the thing was shared and that it was based on someone else's. And if it's a remix of a remix, it will display some portion of that chain. So based on someone else's version of a third person's project. We found that it didn't work. That there was no, that if we compared the projects uploaded right before and right afterwards, we saw no increase, no change in the amount of, in the positive, the proportion of positive or negative comments, or in the amount of silence. That simply attributing work on this system had no effect in terms of changing the proportion of people that were responding positively and negatively. What we then noticed was something right here, which is that in the project notes, many people could leave messages. And actually in that example that I showed you earlier, you can see it right here. It says, sorry if this offends you, Curry, my version of Neo. In lots of projects, we would see things like this. I created this project by remixing Red's project. This was information typed in by the user into the project notes box, which was redundant to the information which was automatically being displayed by the attribution system after it existed, and of course was not beforehand. And what we found is that although if we looked for the presence or absence of automatic attribution, we found no difference. If we looked at the presence or the presence of this kind of mentioning, we saw a huge difference. We saw the proportion of positive comments go from 16% to 30%. People were much, much more happy with remixing in general, at least in terms of the degree to which they were explaining it, when there was this kind of human attribution. And the story here is actually unpacking what attribution is doing. Is that what matters to these users of Scratch is more about credit. It's about the expression of human expression of gratitude, not about the accounting system, which just notes that someone's work has been used. The takeaways here are both methodological and substantive. I think the methodological point is that we can understand why community curators are producing stuff. We can understand aspects of motivation by focusing on this digital trace data. We can look at what people are doing and what all of them are doing, millions of people are doing in these communities to back out this stuff, and use things like these design experiments as a way of building natural experiments that can look at these changes and compare people before and afterwards. The substantive takeaways I think are also potentially interesting to this crowd, which are that this increased effort is associated with unhappiness of reuse, even though that's something that I think a lot of the interviews have also suggested, that these complaints are driven by norms of good or bad, which is also something that we've seen, and that these positive reactions are very often driven by desire for credit, not simply by a desire for attribution. So that is what I've prepared.
And we'll move right along, and then we'll come back around to everybody after. So let's go.
They're both my name.
Wow, turns out having analog notes is really working against me here on this podium.
You can close that, I think, or
Can I?
close the other one. Maybe that's more safe because they want this on the screen on.
Okay,
There we go. Yeah, sure.
okay, excellent,
It
thank
worked.
you. So in an effort to provide something that looks like synthesis, I came here without pre-prepared comments. So we'll see how this goes. But I think what's come out of this event for me partly is a set of relevant questions that much of this work tries to answer, and that I think there's still more work to answer. The first is, in the absence of formal intellectual property protection, which is billed as an incentivizer, what is incentivizing people to create? Or to put it differently, maybe it's not an incentive story at all. Why are people creating? That's one question. Another question is, in communities that are governed by norms, why are people following those norms? And the third question, which I'll come back to after I've talked a little bit about the first two, is what is any given creative community creating? And well, I'll get to why I think that's important, and maybe even more important than the other questions in a moment. So, a few trends that I see sort of coming out in this conversation is that a few things might be driving creation. One, which hasn't come out much today, but a lot of very smart people have thought about it and given compelling arguments, particularly Rebecca Tushnet and some others. One might be compulsion. People might feel like they have to create. So even in the absence of formal protection or any incentive story at all, they may just need to make stuff. Another is that they may crave reputation. For this, obviously, attribution, and I love the distinction between attribution and credit. I think that's a really useful distinction. That would be really important, right? Reputation. A third is indirect economic gain. So economic gain that isn't directly from the thing they're producing, but comes down the line, perhaps through reputation, or perhaps as a loss leader, or some other, maybe a first mover advantage, or maybe a network effect is driving their production. Another, and I'll come back to this in a second, is a sense of community. And I think this is quite possibly a huge one. We've seen over and over again today that a conception of an in-group and an out-group is relevant to these discussions. To almost every one of the discussions, there is a conception of an in-group and an out-group, and that matters to some extent. Okay, so those are possible answers to those questions, to that first question. So on to the second question. What drives people to comply with the norms? This may be a completely different set of answers. And that is the question that I have of late been striving to answer. As a lot of you have heard, I've spent the last year and a half or so just swimming in shame, right? Looking at what shame does, how it works, why people feel ashamed, how they react to being shamed. Another is an innate desire to cooperate or fear of expulsion from a community. It's interesting, Dave, when you raised, are they doing this for cooperation or fear? And I was like, no, they're doing it out of shame. Why isn't he mentioning shame? He should be mentioning shame. Right? But that's obviously my own bias. Because we are all biased toward the thing that we are most knowledgeable about. And another that I'm going to come back to is community, which is an interrelated concept with shame, but I think it may well be that people are driven to create because they want to be part of a community, and they comply with norms because they want to be part of a community. And this is at the center of my current research. I'm spending a lot of time with psychology and sociology and literature trying to figure out how the desire to belong works, or at least how it's theorized to work, and see whether we can sort of learn anything about creative communities by using that frame. Okay, so those are some possible answers to that question. A lesson that I take away from those answers is that the economic incentive narrative clearly cannot be the only narrative. I think we can all agree on that. That's a pretty simple lesson, and if that's the only lesson we get out of this research, I'm not sure we're doing, we're certainly doing a service to intellectual property, but it's a service that we are just doing over and over again. So I think we may want to answer yet more questions. One of those is, what is the community creating? Of course, all of these communities are creating stuff. And the Constitution cares a lot about the creation of stuff, progress-wise. But I think these communities may also be creating something else that we should be interested in, because that something else may be a social good, or on some occasions a social ill. One thing that I think many of these communities are creating is self-actualization. And we've heard that in a few places. I think it's true in some of the compulsion to create communities. I think it's true in some of the belonging-centered communities, that defining oneself is an important element of creation. And in that, it doesn't even matter so much what they're creating themselves. Another thing that I think many of these communities are creating is connections between people, a sense of belonging. That's another social good. And I think a lot of this is informed by my work. It's interesting, we both think we work in Remix. I work in FanWorks a lot. And there, it's very obvious that people are engaging in self-actualization and community building at the same time as they're engaging in stuff creation. Okay. And I think that information, what people are creating, is then going to help us answer the first two questions a little bit. Why are they creating? Well, maybe they're not creating to make stuff. Maybe they're creating for some other reason. Why are they complying with norms? Maybe they're complying with norms for reasons having to do with who they are or what community they're part of. And I think we see that reinforced in the idea, and we've seen this in a few of the case studies today, that it's okay to copy the out-group, but not okay to copy the in-group unless you're engaging with the norms of that in-group. Right? The in-group has its own copying and attribution norms, and you have to follow those if you're going to engage in copying, but we don't care about the out-group, particularly. So, what do I think is the value of generalizing about these things? And I want to start first with something that Aaron said, which I think is a really important proviso to all of this, which is it's extremely difficult to generalize about people's motivations based on the self-reporting, and particularly the sort of limited self-reporting that we're hearing here. However, I think there is something we can get even out of that, and particularly when we pair that with social science research, which is, I think we can look at reasonable behavioral governance mechanisms like shame, like a sense of belonging, and there are, I'm sure, others, right? Those are the two I happen to have focused on. And we can look at the data to see what people think they value. And they may not actually value what they think they value, but we can see what people think they value, and we can map that to behavioral governance mechanisms that we observe from social science. And I think that can inform whether the law is supporting what people value or what governs people's behavior, and what interactions those rules govern. So I'll suggest one based on the belonging research that I'm doing right now. partly for reasons related to shame, partly for reasons related to the fundamental human need for belonging. People follow the norms of their in-group. What that is really, really good for is governing intra-group behavior. It's terrible for governing intergroup behavior. And so one observation that may come out of that, or that I draw from that, is that that's what we need formal law to do. We need the law to govern intergroup behavior. We don't necessarily need it to govern intragroup behavior, and in fact, it may disrupt the very norms that promote productivity in those groups, that promote community building in those groups, that promote self-actualization in those groups. And so that's the lesson that I take away. And I think there are other similar lessons that, right, I am thinking about that little piece of it, but I think there are other similar pieces that we have yet to discover that we can and should look for. And I think one place to look for it is in social science.
Okay. Like Betsy, I have no slides. But I've been listening all day to see whether I would get preempted with the stuff that I did prepare, and the answer is no. So I'm good to go, which is nice. It's nice compliments. So first, thanks to Kate and to Aaron for organizing this conference and for inviting me to be a part of it. I'm very excited to be here. It's been a lot of fun listening to everybody's work. I have 3 general observations to make and elaborate on, but beginning with things derived from the case study reports that we've heard so far today, and then transitioning progressively into observations based on my own work in the area. So first, obviously there's 2 big things to be excited and inspired about in connection with all of these case studies. One is obviously the emergent investment in qualitative, primarily qualitative, empirical legal research, the possibility that it might connect to experimental empirical legal research or connect with qualitative methods from other fields that we haven't yet fully incorporated into the study of legal phenomena. 2 is the idea that we're actually finally, after centuries of experience with intellectual property law, in a position to start exploring sort of ground truth about human experience in creativity-oriented practice or innovation-oriented practice, or the related ideas of information and knowledge, which are not quite identical to ideas about creation and innovation. But in any case, to be able to backstop with empirical data what we have long assumed or believed to be true about the ideas baked into the legal system. Do we need incentives after all? What sort of incentives do we need? Do we need discipline of any sort? Do people respond to discipline? Do people respond to incentives? Those are actually empirical questions that we've taken for granted for a long time, and we're now all as a collective starting to investigate. So that's all pretty common foundation, I think, among most of the people in this room and in this community. So first off, let me interject a note of caution. And the caution is simply that we should have a fair amount of intellectual humility about what we know and about what we're asking. I mean that in a couple of different senses. One, I think it's important to be pretty modest from the get-go about our confidence in the form of the underlying intellectual or cultural frameworks that we bring to the table at the outset when we construct hypotheses or when we construct questions to pursue. If we bring to the table a mental model that is built around the idea of incentives, either because that's what we see happening in some IP industries or because that's what the narrative of standard IP law tells us to do, and then we start asking questions about the presence or absence of incentives in a given community or in a given group, then we will fail to locate useful information, meaningful information about other aspects of that group and its members that might be important with respect to how they behave, how they interact, how they produce or maintain knowledge, information, creation of various sorts. You could say that same flaw or that same risk is present with respect to the expectation that we should see or find variations of discipline or disciplinary rules. There's a flaw with respect to the idea that we should be finding resources in a kind of classic IP sense, so we should be looking for works of authorship, or we should be looking for secrets, or we should be looking for designs or invention. Kathy Strandberg mentioned things along this line earlier today. But see, neither of those propositions may turn out to be true. Discipline may not be important. Discipline may not be present. Resources in that classic IP sense may not be part of the story that we actually discover, but we need to make sure we go into the research with a sufficiently open mind about what we're hoping to learn, that we account for those possibilities. Second, again, in this area of intellectual humility, is the idea we should be modest about our confidence in what we characterize after the fact as our results. So what that means is that as researchers, we're all after generalizable knowledge about the world. We need to find something that is eventually usable and useful other than in a purely historical sense. But there's a two-step process to go through there. Step one, over time, we're able to synthesize lessons from all of the case studies about tattoo artists and roller derby players and chefs and magicians and stand-up comics and adult online producers, and then build some model out of that knowledge that connects them and connects all those different forms of experience to some reasonably well-ordered, somewhat abstracted model of society and culture. Right, so we'll call that sort of an ecosystem level abstraction with whatever variables that we've extracted from our case studies. And then step two, right, we, as lawyers, we map that model of social life, or we map that model of social experience onto some ordered model of human thought. Right? And so that's what we call law, or the legal system. Now, the character of that mapping process is itself an interesting and important question. And so there's a lot of separate questions that have to go into that. But the point is simply that that's a separate step from the first step of generalizing and abstracting what we know about how people actually behave, which is step one. Right? So once we get the step one and step two together, of course, then we achieve the Holy Grail, which is, of course, completely understanding how the experience that we live connects to how we sort of construct an abstracted logical model of that. But people have been trying to achieve that for centuries, right? So you could ask, Aristotle was asking that question. We're just sort of all descendants of Aristotle, meaning for today that it's probably unwise to claim too much that we can learn about any single case that we've actually learned. And that we can't claim to know too much about the world given that case. We can't claim to know too much about the way the legal system or policy implications that should be derived from that single case. Do we need IP-style norms? When are IP-style norms useful? When does the creative world advance effectively in the absence of IP-style norms? If we're honest with ourselves, I think the answers have to be we really don't know very much yet. We have some theories, but they're very provisional and incomplete theories at this point. They need to be explored and refined and revised as we go along, and that's the purpose of continuing with all of the research. So that's point one, humility. Point two is that, in my view, one of the best things to come out of this entire body of research as it emerges is the departure from the longstanding and traditional philosophical commitment, political commitment, to the thinking and behavior of the individual person as the legal and cultural subject and legal and cultural object. Instead, for the most part, we are taking a good long look at institutions. So why is that important, and how is that likely to matter? So I don't mean to say that examining individual thought and individual behavior is not important. It is deeply important for reasons that we've known for many, many years. But it's really hard to see how that kind of very, very fine-grained examination of individual behavior can pay off once we try to generalize and extract from that usable and useful information. Individual preferences, individual behaviors are so variable that it's very, very difficult to scale them effectively, to use the kind of modern buzzword. Likewise, so that's the ground level view of why institutions might be, and probably I think are more important. The high level view, which is to take the social or society level view of things like knowledge or creativity or innovation, it's really, really hard to get traction about those concepts in a concrete way at such a high level. right? So we know that innovation is an important thing to investigate, but you try to investigate innovation at the level of society, and it's really hard to get anywhere. So individuals is sort of a too hard layer to investigate. Society is kind of a too soft layer to investigate. Institutions is kind of a just right layer to investigate. And when I say institutions, I mean everything from formal organizational forms like firms and enterprises and governments and guilds and trade unions, so things that have a well-defined architecture, also to things that are durable and sustained forms of social relations like the university, which Kathy Strandberg and Brett Frischman and I wrote about once, or congregations, or the jury, which are well-established sort of social institutions, sometimes legal institutions, but also including sort of more soft-edge, somewhat fluid, but still recognizable things like disciplines, artistic disciplines, scientific disciplines, academic disciplines, craft-based disciplines, professional disciplines, which are institutions of a sort, even if they do not necessarily have formal logical boundaries to them. They are sort of recognizable enterprises that are worth investigating as such. So I want to focus on institutions for their descriptive importance, that is, in terms of how they help us understand the operation of the world. There's a normative aspect to institutions that I would set aside, and that would be an interesting separate conversation, but that's not primarily what I'm interested in, what I'm talking about today. So institutions are significant in the following ways, again, from a research standpoint in terms of learning about the world. One, if you start at the level of society as a whole, you can think of society as decomposing, to use Herbert Simon's concept. Society decomposes into a tier of institutions. In other work, before I got involved in this business about commons and norm-driven communities, I wrote a paper a number of years ago about the idea of groups and how legal scholars need to focus on groups and groupiness, because groups are kind of a phenomenon that needs to be just investigated. And I got some pushback about the definition of groups, but this is connecting what I'm doing now to what I was thinking about then. If you focus on institutions, or if you focus on groups, then you're able to focus upward, right? So you understand how institutions work, then you can aggregate learning based on investigation of institutions into generalizable knowledge about workings of society as a whole. Second, you can look downward, right? So the arrow points upward into society, but the institutions decompose into individuals. So you can start to explore how the relationship between individuals is expressed at the individual level. So you are still focusing on individual behavior, but you're focusing on individual behavior in context, in organizational context, in institutional context, and in sort of groupiness context. Third, institutions, of course, are related to other institutions. They're related to other institutions in hierarchical senses. So institutions sometimes decompose into lesser, or what we sometimes call nested institutions. Institutions also relate to each other kind of horizontally or laterally. So you end up with groups of institutions or networks of institutions. So you can think of the arrow pointing vertically, and you can think of the arrow pointing laterally, and then you can sort of design kind of a geography of sort of individual, institutional, and social dynamics. That oversimplifies a lot of things, but at least it helps keep us straight, at least in my mind, where the work on IP without IP or norm-driven creativity fits into a larger map of what we're ultimately after, which is impact on public policy in terms of larger social interests. The last thing I would highlight with respect to the interest in institutions is that it's important not only to focus on the dynamics within the institution, but also at the boundaries and the edges and the overlaps and the inconsistencies between and among the institutions themselves. Oftentimes we get interested in institutional dynamics because that's where interesting conflicts emerge, right? There's a sexy case, or there's some kind of a licensing transaction, or there's a treaty negotiation, or there's something interesting happening that is the point of entry. Right? We're going to think about this group or this institution or this behavior because something edgy is happening, and that the edginess is the point of entry. And then we skip over the actual dynamic of the edge, and then we get directly into the behavior or the dynamics of the organization. So I simply want to highlight the fact that the edges, the boundaries, the overlaps, the inconsistencies are phenomena that are really, really important, because that's where a lot of the governance payoff actually takes place. Right? So we've talked a lot about in-group and out-group, insider and outsider behavior, but it's actually the overlap where the interesting governance questions occur, and I think there's a lot of attention that needs to be paid not only to what happens inside the group and what happens outside the group, but exactly it's what's happening at that edge. So that brings me to the third point, which is how this all connects up to my own work with Kathy Strandberg and Brett Frischman. So many of you know, but some of you do not, that the three of us just produced a book that came out earlier this fall called Governing Knowledge Commons, published by Oxford University Press, knowledge-commons.net, with all kinds of sexy information, a mailing list about commons research and so forth that people can join. It's very interesting stuff. So I don't mean to sell the book. What I mean to do is explain a little bit about how our process of producing the book and the point of the book relates up to this field of research. The book itself is 11 case studies. Dave Fagundes is one of the contributors. Kathy, with Brett, has a chapter on the Rare Disease Clinical Research Network. I have a paper about astrophysics, of all things. It's a very, very eclectic mix of case studies, but I really want to draw attention not to the case studies, but to the methods, and how the methods that are the purpose underneath the book are really what connects our work to this creativity without law, or IP without law, IP without IP framework. One, we identify what we're doing as a research framework rather than as a model, rather than as a theory. So this is a rhetorical move that we've borrowed from Elinor Ostrom and her work on natural resource commons. We borrow a lot from Ostrom, but I think this may be the most important piece of Ostrom that we make productive use of, which is we don't know enough about the world to synthesize all of this empirical understanding into a theory or into a model. What we've put out there is a way to collect the information in a research framework. So we've got a flow chart, we've got a description of the method, we've got a one-pager that we can hand out to anybody, which is on the website, that will allow anybody in any discipline to follow this method. But which is iterative and recursive in the sense that as we learn more about the world empirically by applying the research method, we intend to go back and update the research method. And in fact, the last chapter of the present book suggests some specific lessons that we've derived from the first 11 case studies that will cause us to go back and look differently about how to ask those questions in terms of future case studies. Let me highlight one of them because it relates to substantively to some of the themes in the room today. We went into the Knowledge Commons project assuming, as we would as IP scholars and lawyers, that what we needed to do was describe the attributes of the information resources that were present in some shared governance environment, understand how commons governance, rather than sort of proprietary rights-based governance, sort of solved the problems created by the fact that those knowledge resources had certain attributes. So they're public goods, they're intangible, they're difficult to secure and propertize and recover returns on unless you have certain IP rights. What we discovered is that that way of asking the question, that way of framing the question, was seriously incomplete in terms of what we actually observed in many of the Commons case studies that are represented in the book. Commons governance turns out to respond to other kinds of social dilemmas in addition to the kind of public goods character of the resource, that commons communities often are adapting or adopting commons governance shared knowledge strategies to deal with specific kinds of problems in the world that they inhabit rather than specific kinds of problems having to do with the resource sets themselves. There's a lot more nuance to all of that, but that's going to reshape how we think about the prioritization of and the flow of the questions that we ask in terms of future case studies. Second, so that's the methodological humility point, just to make sure it all ties together, right? Second, the institutions point is that commons are institutions. So we've spent literally years, the three of us, wrestling over exactly what to call what we're doing, and we've settled on knowledge commons, frankly, in part because it's easier to capture and repeat. What are you studying? We're studying knowledge commons. But what we're really saying is that knowledge commons is a form of institutional governance. And so in Kathy's slides earlier today, she had that phrase, knowledge commons governance, because that's really what it is. Lawyers from the beginning of our project have pushed back on us to say, define commons. Right? Commons is a thing, therefore you must give it a definition and a set of boundaries, and either this is a commons or that is not a commons, and that's kind of a precondition before you can justify going ahead into any particular research domain. And we resist that, and we resist that intensely, because we really are serious about the idea that this is a research framework that commons is a governance strategy, so it's a way in which resources and people and groups interact with one another, rather than a defined thing that says this is a commons and therefore warrants a certain kind of legal and normative strategy, or not a commons and does otherwise. So commons is a mode of institutional being, you might say, and that's, I think, one of the really important characteristics of what we're saying. So just to conclude, one of the strengths of the knowledge commons framework is that it is intentionally interdisciplinary. The research framework is not a legal research framework. It is something that people from any research discipline, whether it's a social science discipline, a humanities-based discipline, law, or any other field, can borrow and adapt and use in conjunction with their other disciplinary needs and training. So if you look at the case studies in our book, obviously some of them are produced by people who are trained as legal scholars, but we also have case study contributions from people with backgrounds as economists, historians, cultural studies scholars, and anthropologists. So part of what we're trying to do is to create a framework that provides a language in which we can generalize and synthesize knowledge from different topical domains, but also to different disciplinary domains. So I think, I don't want to speak for Kathy or Brett, but I definitely think that a lot of the IP without IP case study research, whether you call it creativity without IP, or IP's negative space, which has been another phrase that has been used. However you characterize it from that perspective, I tend to think a lot of these as commons, knowledge commons, meaning institutionalized forms of sharing knowledge and information that have some relationship to formal IP systems, but may not depend, may depend not at all on formal IP systems. Formal IP systems may play a role. And so the framework offers a way to sort of synthesize the different legal normative perspectives, the different disciplinary perspectives, and so I think that's what we hope we are contributing to this conversation, is a way to sort of aggregate all of this stuff. And we hope that you think that it's useful too. Thanks very much.
So, thank you all very much. Now we'd love for you guys to talk amongst yourselves while we watch, except that I want to trigger you with a couple of things. So, on the issue of methodology, think of you have one of an aggregate set, right? Look at this large group of a relatively young population. And what that suggests to me is, do we need to think a little bit more carefully about the subjects of the study? When you look at the level of individuals, who are the subjects that we're looking at, and do we need to think about what their internal or cognitive structural biases or tendencies might be within the particular framework of creativity, right? Where young people of a certain age are more likely to not be, shall we say, concerned with remuneration in quite the same way that adults are. Right? Is that something that we need to think about when we think about the structural elements of the behavior of that subgroup? Like at the level of the institutions, do we need to think about the fact that, all humility aside, can we talk about institutions separate from the sovereign or the state structure in which they operate? So, Funmi's study about Nigeria, Nollywood. Is there something we can say that isn't just peculiar to the American framework of thinking about how we do this, but that is more related to this? And with respect to that, I asked the question of, when we look at the Berne Convention, Article 6 bis, are we really talking about the residue of that, right? Honor, reputation, and sort of the institution, how the institutions deal with those issues. And can we do more than simply talk about this particular environment in the US? Can we take what we're doing and apply it to Australia, New Zealand, Japan, China? Can we say something interesting there on that broad level, or are we really going to have to be as specific in that way? And then I think the final question, which is, what are the modes of misappropriation? I mean, we use the word copying,
first? I'll go first. Okay, whatever. Prompted by the question about the role of institutions in connection with the state and state borders and boundaries, the cases that we collected and presented in the book, the Knowledge Commons book, in many cases are either grounded explicitly in experience beyond the U.S. or take account of institutional or group behavior that encompasses both U.S. participants and non-U.S. participants, or participants in multiple states at the same time. I think that we have tried not to invest in our framework too heavily in the idea of sort of state-specific or culture-specific context, but to sort of have a framework that allows for both ways of looking at the question for sort of very, very micro level, local level kinds of behaviors, as well as behaviors that transcend national boundaries, either because they are transcending them in terms of virtual relationships, or because some of the material in the book is actually quite historical, goes back to the early 20th century, or in some cases goes back to the 19th century, much more sort of traditional analog ways of social interaction as well. So I don't think we don't want to make a prejudgment about this being a micro level or a macro level or a mezzo level phenomenon. I think that we want to be inclusive of all of those different possibilities. The one thing that I would add, maybe it's related to this, maybe it's not, but it's actually kind of a response to Betsy's comments. As lawyers, particularly as IP lawyers, I think we spend an enormous amount of time looking for the possibility that bad things might happen. And we need to somehow develop rules or systems or institutions or organizations to make sure that bad things don't happen. The idea that good things could happen is kind of a taken for granted. We want creativity in some respect to be the outcome, but we're not primarily worried about the character of the creativity that comes out. We just want to make sure that misappropriation, or we want to avoid shame, we want to avoid being excluded from the group. I want to include the possibility that the entire system is suffused with joy. That why do people create? They want to be joyful, they want to express joyfulness, they want to find joyfulness in their lives. Why do they want to participate in communities? Why do they follow norms? Because it makes them happy. What is being created? Joy, which is not, of course, not a conventional form of IP-oriented creativity, but I think it's present in many, many contexts, and I think that we should be inclusive of that as well as the more sort of disciplinary-oriented kind of thing. And of course, joy gets expressed, if you take that seriously, in different ways at different times and in different places, right? So Nigeria and Nollywood, there is clearly a sense of joy, not having studied any of it, but listened to Funmi give this talk or a version of it multiple times. There is clearly a sense of optimism and joy associated with that activity, and I think that you get into the roller derby world, for example, or the stand-up comedy world, for example, or the tattoo world, or even, I'm willing to say this, the adult online entertainment world. There is a sense of happiness. I'll stop on characterizing the adult online world there, but you can draw your own inferences. But I think it's important to have a research framework that accounts for that doesn't get too invested in the idea of discipline and misappropriation and harm to reputation.
I can go next to follow that, because I think that's very consistent with one of the questions that I really think is important to answer, which is what is being created. And I wholeheartedly agree that very often what is being created is joy. And maybe different kinds of joy. And so I think that the Constitution may not place a huge value on joy, but I think it makes sense for us to, for us to at least consider it. Sorry? Pursuit of happiness. There we go. I meant the IP clause, but you're absolutely right. So I agree wholeheartedly, and I think it's worth recognizing the social benefits or social ills that may result from particular creation as distinct from but very complementary to whatever else is being created. I wanted to address your question about what are the modes of misappropriation, and I think that's a really important question, because I don't think they look the same in every creative community. I think what they have in common is that they make the misappropriation victim unhappy. Otherwise, they're not misappropriation. And I think what we are often thinking about could broadly be placed under the umbrella of imitation. Imitation doesn't necessarily mean copying. It doesn't have anything to do with the idea-expression dichotomy, or, you know, as Chris was identifying earlier, right? There are some real disjunctions between what formal law thinks shouldn't be copied and what various creative communities think shouldn't be copied. But I think that, by and large, the things that can be misappropriated fall into the category of imitation, and often depend very much on moral intuition, as distinct from, for example, economic benefit. Right? So, I was imitated in a way that was unfair. Or I was imitated in a way that hurt my feelings, or I was imitated in a way that hurt my bottom line down the road, right? But this idea that there's a combination of imitation and conflict with moral intuition that seems to underlie most of the wrongs in these categories, I think. And I think that's, I think those are the sorts of things that I would be looking for if I were doing a case study, which fortunately I've been able to just free ride on everyone else's case studies so far.
Sure. Well, I'll respond to the thing about Scratch being so the work that I presented here was Scratch, and it was mostly kids. And I think that I guess I have two things to respond to that. One is that, as a methodology, there's nothing that says you can only study Scratch in the kind of way that I'm talking about here. And in fact, I've done a lot of research in a community called Wikia, which is 80,000 wikis on lots of fan culture stuff. Similar kinds, I've done papers on governance. You can do exact same kinds of methodological approaches can be used in lots of different kinds of communities. An interesting thing about, I've done work in Wikipedia, which is very similar. I've done some stuff in free and open source software as well. So from that said, I don't think that the broader questions about generalizability from one community to others go away because it's no longer just kids. There are really important questions about that are empirical questions, but that are hard to answer about the extent to which a particular result in a particular community will, apply somewhere else. And lots of reasons to believe that in lots of examples it won't. Do the particular, the developmental things about studying kids make a difference? Yes. But they also provide real opportunities, for example. One challenge with studying free and open source software, which shares a lot of things in common with software production like this, is that a majority of contributions to at least the biggest and most commonly used projects are paid. And so if you're interested in motivation, for example, it's when we know why they're doing it, they're getting paid to do it. And so, despite the fact that it is then being, freely shared, so on and so forth, but it makes it harder to study these more subtle questions of, how people feel and how that affects their desire to do something later on. So, it's tough, and and I think that what it requires is maybe more of what we're talking about, of thinking across projects, of looking beyond single examples.
Yeah. So. The data sets that you have access to and the character of the data that you have access to actually allow us, if you wanted to do it this way, to answer a question like, what are the modes of misappropriation? Right? So we have an initial sketch of what those modes of misappropriation are. And so when you ask the question as a lawyer, as an IP lawyer, my initial reaction is, that sounds like a trademark law question, for example, right? So there's sort of appropriation of goodwill. There's sort of there's an economics-oriented framework for answering that question based on sort of consumer deception and harm to consumers. There's a loss of goodwill based on the investment by the people who produce the goods labeled with the mark. There's a kind of set of dignity harms associated with the reputational consequences to the individual. There's a dignity harm associated with the collective, so the failure to engage in certain reciprocity norms in sort of trademark settings where you've got more of a collective interest. So you could map that provisional set of harms into a coding instruction that you could then take into the data set and see how well, so then use that to code the commentary that you've got access to in your data set, and see how well your coding sheet matches up with, how many outliers do you have? How many things do you have that are not coded adequately by that initial set? So then you have to go back, iteratively update your data set, because maybe you find a collection of responses that doesn't map onto that provisional initial set, and then you just sort of...
Or in ways that I've suggested here, that I've showed here, if you have theories about the way, if you have a coding system which does apply, but you have theories about why you might see one type of behavior as opposed to something else, you can test it, right? You can do hypothesis tests and understand whether or not in a particular community that applies. Now, I mean, we can if we have access to multiple similar data sets in different communities, we can do the same type of study in different places, and we'll find that some communities are, people in some communities behave like they do in other communities, and sometimes they don't. And understanding why is the sort of the next step in this broad research project. But I don't know. I don't think there's an easy answer.
Well, I wanted to add something just to the question, to the point on how much are we thinking about the subject here? Mm-hmm. And there's a completely different answer to the same question, which is it's orthogonal to your answer. But there's always the problem when you're doing human subject research of interfering with the subject. And I think one of my fears about even asking some of these questions, right? I have this sort of pipe dream that someday I'm going to do one of these qualitative case studies with knitters. And I'm really worried that I'm going to mess up the knitters, because I'm a lawyer and I'm looking for questions about rights and questions about wrongs. And if they're not already thinking about them, I don't want to put those in their heads, right? So I think that this question of sort of what we should be thinking about with regard to the subjects is a really is a question we shouldn't forget about.
Yeah, with respect to the qualitative analysis, I mean, there's ways to do this so that you don't frame the analysis in that way. You don't frame it on rights and wrongs. You frame it around events or practices, or just there are ways that you get at it indirectly that don't shape their behavior hopefully as much, but it is a problem. So Megha, I wanted to ask you about the study, and in particular I had a methodological question and then a framing question.
Okay, well, there were actually a couple different studies that were in there, but
Scratch
okay.
study.
Well, no, but there were a couple different Scratch studies. I've written a lot on Scratch, but
So the methodological question is about your measure of complexity. So I saw on the graph on the right, so there's number of sprites in a program. So is that a robust measure of complexity?
We have a bunch of different, there's a bunch of different measures of complexity that we've used. So if I'm remembering in the first one, I think that we do use number of sprites. We also have other measures which are the same kind of thing, but more granular in the sense of number of lines. Think of it as lines of code, that kind of stuff, right? We have other measures which we've used, which have had, I don't know if we've run this particular model, but we've done is we've found is very often highly correlated, will be measures that are associated with the amount of time someone spends working on it. So we actually have pretty granular information of how much time they've worked on it. And you find that those are also very strongly correlated. So, but that said, I mean, you're completely right. Like someone, in some sense, you might actually like the thing that is, it's the I would have, if I'd had more time, I would have written less kind of approach, right?
Right.
Sometimes conciseness can be very valuable as well.
Of course, yeah. Complexity is not iron-bound with length or...
Right.
Yeah. So the other question, I think the much more important question is the framing question, which is, so I'm unsure what to take away, and that's always a question about these studies. So we have a site that has a certain structure. It has a sharing structure at its heart, right? And it's set up to do that. And so the people on that site might be selected for that, right? And because they're kids, maybe the selection's a little weird. We don't really know if kids come to this activity with any any priors about sharing, not sharing, ownership. But there's always this question, which I think your study raises.
So I'll say that both of those studies had, we do have, although it's like, all the data that we use there is public data, and with the exception of age and gender, which self-reported age and gender, which we have access to. We haven't found in either of these studies. They're both in the papers, but no strong developmental effects. It didn't substantively change the nature of the finding. But you're right.
Strong developmental effects.
In the sense that like it's not like like the effect only works with older kids, but not because we have a range, right?
Yeah, I'm not even talking about age.
Okay.
I'm just talking about kids coming to the study, you don't know what their priors are about sharing. You don't know if they have any, right? But they come to because they're kids, here's a hypothesis, they come to a site that privileges sharing, and this actually forms their preferences. Their preferences become endogenous on the norms of the site, the norms as expressed in code. So in other words, which way does the causal arrow
So
flow?
I will point you to, so the first study that I showed, which is looking at responses to remixing, is co-authored with the creator of the online community, a guy named Andres Monroy Hernandez, who's at Microsoft Research now, and Christina Olson, who is a developmental social psychologist, who's now at the University of Washington with me. She was at Yale at the time, and who's done research on exactly this issue. And so this project came out of conversations with her about how kids and when kids develop senses of ownership in particular kinds of like work products, like when do they feel that this idea is theirs, and do they think about it in terms of a particular, like a type of ownership, or is it more or is it different? And I'd point you to her research, to her other research, I suppose, which is much for the, basically all except for this very more traditional, lab-based social psychological research, where they're having kids and creating these little situations where they'll have them, here's this image that you drew, but it's made by someone else, that kind of stuff, right?
So based on that research, are you confident that the results here are not endogenous on the sites?
I think that this is in line with the body, with her other body of work. So am I confident that it's not endogenous in the site? It's hard to be.
Doesn't swamp.
I don't think that I think that this is the story, but I would point you to her work and encourage you to, if you're interested in this question, and encourage you to make up your own mind. Yeah.
So could I just add something to this, not directly on your study, of course, but prompted by Chris's comment or question about endogeneity, which is something that many of us know but often don't make explicit in conversations like this, which is that the phrase creativity, which is, this is partly a rhetorical point, but it's also a conceptual point. Are we talking about inputs or are we talking about outputs, right? So to some extent, creativity is talked about and conceived of as an sort of an intellectual or emotional property of us as individuals. So I am creative, I possess creativity, therefore I can accomplish certain things. And then in other ways, primarily I think more the context of the way IP scholars or IP lawyers talk about this, creativity is a payoff, right? So when I make something, I have expressed creativity into the world in some kind of embodiment. And of course, I think maybe deliberately sometimes we conflate those two meanings of creativity, but I think it's important to tease them out for research purposes to understand whether we're talking about inputs to the system or outputs to the system, or how those two relate to one another.
Yeah, so I will say one more thing about thinking about the endogeneity question in the context of Scratch, which is that the fact that kids were unhappy with remixing, when like administrators of the site were doing everything they could to frame remix as a way that was more positive. They were, they didn't want that effect. So I mean, that's not to say that it isn't endogenous, right? But it is to say that they were working hard to, the existence of that automatic attribution thing was added as a way of helping encourage a type of behavior within the community that wasn't present, or at least wasn't as present as they would want. So, right.
Not arguing in either direction.
Yeah.
So that's,
Yeah.
I'm not pro-negging or anti-negging,
Yeah.
which is what they're doing. They're just negging.
Yeah.
Right? And this is another question, whether negging is equivalent to anything else that you might do.
Yeah.
Is a lawsuit negging? It's a pretty distinct form of negging. So we should talk.
Yeah.
So I actually want to just piggyback on that, because so your question was sort of if these sharing communities pre-selecting for people who are already pro-sharing or creating people who are pro-sharing. And I had a different reaction, which is if what we're looking for is what conditions are conducive to creation without formal law, it may not matter. It may not, the causal arrow may not matter if we're asking what conditions are conducive to creation without formal law.
Well, it might matter from the perspective of a designer. Like if you're a,
yes.
Yeah,
Oh,
so,
absolutely.
So if you're the designer of a community, right, which is the kind of people that, Andres Monroy, the other person who worked on that work, he's a community designer basically. He designs online communities and socio-technical systems, and he thinks a lot about how to do that. So from that perspective, it might matter.
Of course.
Yeah.
It also matters moral. Is what is normal moral, or what is moral normal? That's like a huge moral question.
But one thing, Chris, this goes back to actually a conversation we were having at lunch, is that I don't think that question is specific to the kind of community that Mako is studying. I mean, I think in general, when you have communities that are formed voluntarily, as opposed to say, we all live around this lake, so we all are here, you're always going to have a co-creation of the norms of the community and who's in the community.
Right.
So that's, I mean, I think it's important to recognize that, I agree, but I don't think it's something that you can really avoid. In any community where people voluntarily join it, there is an endogeneity to the creation of the norms and the creation
Yeah, but it can still be very useful, I think, to think about what people are coming with versus what they are developing, because to the extent that there are serious limits to what a designer can do, understanding where those limits are is very useful information to have.
So Mako, to what extent do you have data on, so you've got this distinction between credit and attribution, right? So to what extent do you have data on changes in the amount of what you're calling credit, right? Before and after the imposition of automatic attribution, right? Because this might be, I agree with Kathy, Chris, right? I mean, I think, there's endogeneity here clearly, but that's not the point. The point is like how and why and how can we measure it and what does it look like and how does it get formed, right? So that, so one of the things I'm wondering here is like, to the extent that you begin to enforce mandatory attribution, how does that affect the voluntary provision of credit?
So that is something we looked at. I don't remember the answer. It might be in the paper. If it isn't, you can let me know. It is. We have. Do we have the data? Yes. Did we code it? Did we code up for it? Yes. But I don't remember. I don't remember the answer off the top of my head. What I do recall is that this result caused us to, when they were designing the new version of Scratch, think about, for example, how to design the system so that so that we could get users of the site to increase the rate at which they were providing that kind of credit giving, in addition to attribution. So, for example, creating a box on the site next to the project note, which is there anyone you would like to thank? For example, the creator of the project, this sort of thing, right? There are systematic ways in which you can design systems so that the kinds of behavior that have more positive effects can, I don't remember exactly how it got built into the new version of the system, but that was a conversation that happened after, as a result of this study.
Do you learn anything about who gets credit? Right. So, if what you're trying to suggest is that credit is doing a lot of work that attribution isn't in terms of shaping how people view downstream, right? So you need to isolate the thing that like the credit is special in some way, right? And the credit is not a confound for something else. Like, the people I'm crediting are also people I know, right?
Right.
So,
or people that are famous within a community, for example, right? And we see, for example, in other work we've looked at the antecedents of remixing. So we look at what causes projects to be remixed, and you see, for example, that like more famous people within Scratch, even controlling for how visible or viewed a particular project is that more famous people in Scratch are more likely to have their work become the sites for collaboration and remixing.
So step in and sort of give ourselves one last question. So the attractiveness of the architectural design community, I think, is very clear. Right? I think it's important to remember how many of these nevertheless are sort of what we think of as natural communities that precipitate out of particular environments that aren't necessarily designed. And so we might want to think about a distinction between the design framework, where you set up a series of initial conditions and that gives you some control over that. And there are lessons we learn from that, but it's important also to look at non-designed communities and look at what their formation looks like. And that may be one area where we may not have much data necessarily. But let's hear from you guys and then we'll take one more question.
So in the spirit of my comment previously about the sort of conceptual character of creativity, let me offer a counterpart comment about the conceptual character of community, which is that there is a risk in this work of sort of fetishizing the idea of community, and as a result sort of marginalizing the significance of the work. So I remember, I was in law school. I had Bob Alexson as a land use professor in law school at the time that he was doing his work on Shasta County and cattle. And Order Without Law came out, and it was this transformative book. And one of the lessons that a lot of legal scholars took away from Order Without Law for a long time was that norm-based governance only worked in small, homogeneous communities. And that became kind of an article of faith. And it's terribly misleading and sort of disruptive of a lot of really important work. I think it's fair to say that as a result of the outcome of some of these social interactions, we can sort of retrospectively characterize the population of people or population of organizations that are participating in some norm-governed space. We'll call that a community because we sort of need to capture that population in some respect, but that we shouldn't make the mistake of looking ex ante for some small homogeneous group of people, because there's plenty of examples empirically out there, and whether it's online or offline, it doesn't have to be an internet-based phenomenon, of much broader, more distributed, somewhat heterogeneous collections of people who nonetheless observe regular patterns of behavior that we'll call norms if we wish to, or at least cooperate and collaborate in ways that are not necessarily disciplined by IP law. So we'll capture them in some meaningful way and then learn generalized knowledge about them. So it's sort of a caution about the rhetorical impact of the word community, because it sometimes has a tendency to do more work than it should.
So I actually think that we need to thank our panel and move on to keep us on schedule to our last group.